Welcome to the American Timeline. Today we will discuss a story quietly glossed over by official history, a truth buried among documents.
On the morning of June 17, 1876, in this deep gorge of the Rosebud Valley in the southwestern Montana Territory, United States forces of about 1,300 men under the command of Brigadier General George Crook were advancing north. Crook had given his army a break that morning. Some were brewing coffee, some were watering the horses, while some officers were fishing in the creek by the shore. This scene itself is a document in its own right. An army advancing deep into enemy territory, right into the heart of the combined Sioux and Northern Cheyenne forces, was taking a break in a picnic-like atmosphere thanks to its commander's confidence. To understand George Crook, one must first grasp who he was. Crook was a truly respected figure in the American military of that era. With his weather-beaten face, long hair, and forked beard tied in a ponytail, he was a commander who had become a legend within his own corps. The media described him not as Big Smoke, but as Gray Wolf, due to his quiet and methodical nature. His experience in the Apache Wars had taught him the parameters of fighting the natives, or so he thought. It is exactly this verb, to think, that created the actual murder of June 17th. Crook's mental map that morning was extremely clear and extremely flawed. Intelligence reports, which would later be brutally revealed as inadequate and biased, told him that the native groups in the area were demoralized, few in number, and disorganized. Large campfires had been seen, yes, but Crook attributed these to a warrior band of a few hundred. The actual number was 10 to 15 times this estimate. That same morning, behind the hills to the north of the valley, an army of warriors, whose numbers historians would later estimate to be between 2,000 and 3,500, stood ready in the morning mist, holding its breath, feeling the physical weight of the weight in every muscle. The commander of this army, or more accurately, its spiritual and strategic architect, was Tashunka Uitko of the Oglala Sioux. Known in history as Crazy Horse, one of the most original military geniuses of his time in terms of battle tactics. The strategy Crazy Horse implemented that morning is an almost perfect prototype of what modern military terminology defines as a funnel trap, advancing the enemy through a narrow geographical corridor, deploying forces along both sides and exit points of this corridor, and then attacking when the enemy is at their most vulnerable, that is, during that break when their morale is highest, but their attention is most scattered. The thousands of warriors in the hills had remained silent for hours. This silence cannot be underestimated. The pre-battle waiting discipline of a Sioux warrior was not something the Western military understanding was accustomed to. Raised in nature since childhood, carrying the patience of hunting in their blood, these people could remain motionless for hours simply with the weight of their beliefs, without needing hourly pep talks, drums, or bugles. Even the horses seemed to share in this silence, in an anxious but obedient state of waiting. In Crook's headquarters, the atmosphere was the exact opposite. Officers were talking among themselves, soldiers were joking, and the fishing groups by the shore were laughing out loud. Crook was watching this scene, and this scene confirmed to him that he was right. If there was no enemy, there was no panic. If there was no panic, there was no danger. This circular logic is the most dangerous cognitive structure produced by hubris. Instead of questioning reality, molding reality to fit one's own expectations. The decisions Crook made that morning, the break, the permission to hunt, keeping the scouting patrols limited, have been analyzed time and again by historians. Any one of these decisions, on its own, could be read as a reflection of a commander's state of mind that day. But when read together, the resulting picture is not merely a series of mistakes, it is a systematic collapse of perception. Crook was not actually seeing his enemy that morning. He was seeing the next step of his own victory, and the enemy required for that step was entirely different from the real enemy, a much smaller and much more submissive figure. On the hills of the valley, in the windless air, not a single leaf was moving. It was a few minutes past 9 in the morning. Along the banks of Rosebud Creek, the Crow and Shoshone allied scout groups from Crook's vanguard forces continued to advance north. Like a vulnerable finger extended forward, detached from the main body. In this part of the valley, the creek bed was winding, visibility was limited, and the hills squeezed both sides a little more with every step. The scouts rode their horses, their eyes on the ground, leaning forward with the automatic attention of tracking reflexes. None of them were looking at the sky. None of them had noticed the change in the quality of that deep, breathless silence behind the hills. Or perhaps they had, and that primitive defense mechanism of the brain that denies danger had kicked in. It remains unknown. Then the sound came. It wasn't a single sound, it was a wave of sound that seemed to erupt from thousands of lungs simultaneously, multiplying and growing as it crashed against the two walls of the valley, vibrating not the eardrum, but the ribcage, the spine, the earth beneath the feet. To even call it a war cry diminishes this sound. It was the kind of sound where the human voice pushes the laws of physics, where the animalistic and the sacred unite, where thousands of years of martial tradition condense and explode in a single moment. The Crow Scouts instantly turned their horses. There was no thought in this decision, only the body, the raw command of the survival instinct bypassing all philosophical debate. On the ridge of the hills, the horizon line, which had stood as silent as if it didn't exist until that moment, suddenly poured forth. Even the word poured is not enough. It exploded, spilled, surged. When the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne warriors began to emerge from behind the hills, at first glance, this sight was not something the mind could reconcile. Because the enemy that the American officers, Crook, and all those intelligence reports were mentally prepared for was supposed to be a scattered, disorganized, demoralized group. Yet what appeared before them was the exact opposite. An organized flood of humanity flowing in wings with a coordinated and deliberate geometry, simultaneously beginning to close every exit point of the valley, giving the impression of being in invisible communication with each other even while riding their horses. It is necessary to underline this organization, because the American military literature of the period systematically downplayed this point. The 19th century American colonial discourse found it advantageous to describe native warriors as savage and disorganized. This description served both a political and psychological function. But at the Rosebud, on the morning of June 17th, how hollow and dangerous this discourse was proven in a bloody manner. The attack led by Crazy Horse was a military operation executing simultaneously on multiple fronts, brought to life solely through pre-planned coordination and execution discipline, without a centralized communication infrastructure. The complexity level of this operation was comparable to any European military maneuver of that era. By the time the news reached Crook's main forces, the vanguard lines had already collapsed. Even as the messengers rode their horses into the camp, the sound of the war cries behind them was catching up to them. In Crook's headquarters, the first seconds experienced that frozen, inoperable moment the human mind goes through when faced with an unexpected threat. Officers looked at each other. Orders were given, retracted, given again. Units searched for their weapons. Some were out fishing. Some had not tied their horses. Some were simply dozing on their backs just a few minutes prior. This was the image not of an army, but of a crowd that had been ambushed and had not yet accepted it. As the warriors flooded into the valley, the concrete manifestation of tactical genius was clearly visible. While a wave drove directly at the central front, two flanking groups turned to close the valley's side exits. Had this pincer movement been completed, the retreat path for Crook's forces would have been completely sealed. This was Crazy Horse's calculation, and this calculation contained extremely few errors in its execution phase. Crook's Crow and Shoshone allies were perhaps the element that saved the entirety of the forces in those chaotic first minutes. These allied warriors, due to their deep-rooted enmity with the Sioux, had developed much faster reflexes than regular American soldiers, and were experienced in this type of high-tempo, close-quarters combat. They formed a temporary barrier ahead of the first wave. This barrier was not perfect, it was not consistent, but it allowed the main forces to grab their weapons and form a defensive line, albeit a disorganized one, in the critical minutes. But the word disorganized is the essence of this picture. Crook's forces were not a fighting army that morning. They were a crowd trying to survive. Officers were trying to maintain the chain of command, but the acoustic chaos created by the dust cloud, horse neighs, gunshots, and war cries coming from all directions made it almost impossible to transmit orders. Some platoons acted on their own. Some retreated. Some rushed forward. Coordination had begun to shatter from the first contact. Crook's psychological state in these first minutes can be partially reconstructed in the light of the notes he personally kept and the statements he later gave. The notes are kept in a cold-blooded and technical language. This composure does not show the truth, but how the truth was intended to be presented. A commander's true psychology in the midst of battle is hidden not in notes shaped by a pen later, but in the inconsistency of the orders he gives in that moment. And the orders Crook gave that morning are undeniably the products of a loss of control. Dust was rising from every corner of the valley. Not smoke, dust. The dry, cracked earth of the Rosebud was being hurled skyward in massive gray clouds under thousands of horse hooves and human feet. This dust didn't just block vision. It clogged throats, lungs, and eyes. Men became unable to see their comrades 2 meters away. Under these conditions, the question, "Where is the enemy?" became meaningless, because the enemy was everywhere. In every direction the sound came from, in every point where a shadow moved, in every silhouette appearing within the dust. This was the moment the model of war that the American soldiers carried in their minds collapsed. This force facing them was not a group of people fleeing in small, scattered bands, waiting to be caught. This was an army organized and planned to destroy them, executing that plan with a flawless sense of timing. The psychological shock created by this realization operated as a separate layer from the physical threat, because when reality fails to align with the mental model of war, that is, the feeling of, "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," it produces a terror that paralyzes a person. Inside that dust cloud, in the narrow gorge of the Rosebud Valley, Crook's forces were fighting to survive. Nothing remained of that peaceful morning of fishing. Battle has a sound, and this sound is entirely different from what those who haven't experienced it imagine. Movies have taught us a clean, comprehensible sound of war. Gunshots are distinct and separable. Orders are heard. Heroes recognize each other. The reality of Rosebud was the exact opposite. There, sound was not something separated. It was a single, crushing mass. The simultaneous discharge of hundreds of weapons, the struggle of thousands of horse hooves against the earth, the screams of the wounded, the silence of the dying, and over all of this, that continuous, superhuman war cry swallowing everything. Within this mass of sound, to hear an officer's order, to pick out a friend's cry for help, or even to complete one's own thoughts, was almost impossible. Rosebud, on June 17, 1876, first became a hell of sound. The violence arrived within this, as the content filling this sound. Crook's forces did what survivors do after the initial shock. They held on. This holding on was reflexive and scattered, but it was real. Some platoons found natural shelters, rock outcroppings, hollows in the creek bed, flats on the hill ridges. These points became instant defensive lines, not planned, but instinctive. Officers tried to command, but command had ceased to be a linear thing that morning. Every point was fighting its own battle. Every platoon was making its own calculation for survival. Crook's force technically remained a single army, but in practical reality, it had turned into disconnected islands, each struggling in its own little hell. The Sioux and Northern Cheyenne warriors systematically exploited this disarray. The most striking dimension of Crazy Horse's tactical understanding was the application of continuous movement and pressure instead of a static siege. The warriors did not settle into a fixed line. On the contrary, they kept the American soldiers under constant threat from different directions by darting forward and retreating in waves. This tactic produced two critical results. First, it caused the American forces to deplete their limited ammunition reserves much faster. Second, it pushed psychological exhaustion far ahead of physical fatigue. Being constantly on alert, constantly watching every direction, waiting for the wave that would inevitably follow every retreat. This grinds a person down not in hours, but in minutes. At the points where the conflict turned into close combat, The practical meaning of technological superiority was seen to vanish. Springfield rifles and Colt revolvers provided an undeniable advantage in open terrain and at a sufficient distance. But in the narrow valley of the Rosebud, amidst the dust cloud, in a firefight conducted at a distance of 5 to 10 meters, a large part of this advantage evaporated. Reloading time was a fatal flaw at close range, and the firing rate and accuracy of the Sioux warriors' arrows functioned much more efficiently than a rifle at this distance. At some points, the combat turned entirely to physical contact: knives, tomahawks, and rifle butts. In these moments, the difference between years of training and the experience of warriors who grew up and hardened in nature became visible to the naked eye. The moments when psychological collapse began among Crook's soldiers are documented in the testimonies of the survivors. Sergeant Stanislaus Roy's later testimony constitutes perhaps one of the most staggering records of these moments. Roy recounts that at one point in the battle, 4 men in his platoon fell within minutes, and a 5th man dropped his weapon and started running while screaming. This flight reflex is not a product of disciplinary collapse, but of a human's mental capacity reaching its limit. When the brain becomes unable to process a threat above a certain intensity, it reverts to its most primitive program: flee. What Roy himself did is noteworthy. He did not flee, but he says he consciously made the decision not to run. This consciousness shows what an exceptional thing it was at that point in the battle. The transport of the wounded turned into a humanitarian flailing rather than a military operation that morning. Rosebud's geography made carrying the wounded systematically impossible. The bends of the creek bed, the obstacles formed by rock blocks, the conflict points that could reignite at any moment. These turned moving a wounded person to a safe point into a small military operation of its own. Some soldiers carried out these operations and risked their lives. Some wounded were left where they were, ahead of the advancing enemy warriors, on the dry, Rosebud soil. These choices are the products of a raw and brutal reality that renders abstract discussions of martial morality meaningless. Before noon, after about 2.5 hours of combat, the nature of the battle began to change. This change was not sudden but gradual and palpable. The pressure from the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors was not decreasing, but Crook's forces had emerged from the initial shock paralysis and begun to re-establish the basic elements of organization. Some officers established an effective line of command. Some positions were reinforced. Ammunition resupply points were designated. This was not a victory. It was the concrete manifestation of survival, of the will to preserve crumbs of order despite the chaos. But how much these crumbs cost was written in the number of those lying in every corner of the creek bed. Crook's casualties were officially recorded as 28 dead and approximately 56 wounded at the end of the battle. These numbers are disputed. Some historians argue that the actual loss was much higher, especially considering that the Crow and Shoshone Allied casualties were underreported. The casualties on the Sioux and Cheyenne side are even more ambiguous in historical records. Estimates range from 30 to 60. But beyond these numbers, the real loss occurred elsewhere, a kind of loss that is hard to measure and does not make it into official reports. This loss was Crook's forces' fighting capacity, or rather, the belief in that capacity. There is a deep difference between physically destroying an army and breaking that army's spirit. Rosebud achieved the latter. By the end of that day, the surviving soldiers had internalized the answer to a question far more important than, where are we physically? Who was facing us? And the answer to this question shattered all the assumptions they had held up until that day. They were not facing a small, scattered, demoralized group. Facing them was an organized, experienced army, utterly determined to destroy them, making perfect use of the geography of their own lands. The soldiers who realized this truth for the first time that day, in that valley, amidst that dust and blood, would never be the same again. And this psychological transformation was the result of Rosebud that didn't enter the casualty lists, but perhaps showed its effect for the longest time. Crook had understood this reality before anyone else, and precisely because of this, his subsequent decision would take its place in history as an unprecedented evasion of responsibility. Battlefields have a smell, and this smell is etched into the minds of those who lived that day. gunpowder, blood, burned leather, and the moisture emerging from the depths of the earth, evaporated by heat. That afternoon at the Rosebud, amidst this smell, was silently writing the final line of an altered equation. Crook gave the retreat order around 2 in the afternoon. This decision was described as a tactical redeployment in the reports he later penned. This sterile language of military terminology both hides and reveals the truth, because tactical redeployment is an alleviating euphemism used for situations where a commander leaves the battlefield to the enemy and retreats. That is exactly what Crook did that day. He abandoned the battlefield. He gathered his dead, loaded his wounded, and set off towards the south, the opposite of the direction he had come. A rule is underlined in military historiography. The side that abandons the battlefield is the side that lost the battle. This rule is not a political statement, but an operational reality. At the Rosebud, the side that remained on the battlefield was the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. They were the ones who controlled that land. They were the ones who lit fires in that valley that evening. They were the ones who were still there at the first light of morning. Crook, on the other hand, had retreated south, reached his camp at Goose Creek and stayed there. For a long time, an alarmingly long time. The real tragedy lay within this long pause. Crook stayed in the Goose Creek camp for about 50 days. 50 days. During this time, events in the north did not stop. On the contrary, developments that would become turning points in history began to accumulate. But from Crook's tent, no action emerged that could intervene in any of these developments, shape them, or at least warn others. It didn't emerge because what Crook was doing in that tent was not military planning. He was calculating how to write his report, how to frame Rosebud, how to make a defeat not look like a defeat. This calculation gave birth to one of the most costly ego operations in human history. To understand Crook's situation at Rosebud, one must grasp the weight of his career at that point. Crook commanded one of the 3 main columns of the Northern Plains campaign. This campaign was the military leg of the Ulysses Grant administration's policy to decisively bring the Sioux territories under control. The other 2 columns of the campaign were Colonel John Gibbon's Western Forces and the Eastern Forces commanded by General Alfred Terry. Within Terry's corps was George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry Regiment. The plan was simple. The 3 columns would squeeze the native forces and crush them in a coordinated manner. But for the plan to work, the 3 columns needed to see, hear, and know each other. What Crook learned at Rosebud shattered the fundamental assumption of this plan. The force facing them was not a scattered group waiting to be squeezed. On the contrary, it was a massive and coordinated army moving under central leadership, capable of crushing the 3 columns one by one and in turn. This information was vital for the survival of the other 2 columns. Transmitting this information was not a courtesy, but a military necessity. Not a choice, but an order. Crook did not transmit this information. Historians have debated the reasons for this silence for decades, and this debate harbors several mutually non-exclusive explanations. The first explanation is practical. The communication infrastructure of that era was highly inadequate. Messenger systems were slow, unreliable, and extremely dangerous in terrain controlled by enemy forces. This explanation contains the truth, but not the whole truth. Crook had the capacity to send messengers when necessary, as he later demonstrated. The choice was not an incapacity. The second explanation is psychological and points to a much darker place. Crook did not want to officially register his failure at Rosebud. To convey this meant telling Terry, and thus the chain of command, "My corps was ambushed, we abandoned the battlefield, and we are currently spending our 50th day in a camp tent." The damage this confession would do to his career was not something Crook could calculate. But there was no need to even calculate it, because every officer's instinct knows what this confession means. An admission of failure would enter his promotion file. The hero's story would be replaced by the shame of an ambushed commander. And this calculation turned into an 8-day silence. June 25th, 1876, Little Bighorn. When Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment descended into the valley that morning, the intelligence reports he had were severely incomplete. The information he received from Terry's headquarters predicted that the native forces in the region consisted of a power of probably a few hundred, perhaps not exceeding 1,000 men. The source of this prediction was partly inadequate reconnaissance, partly biased analysis, and partly a systematic information gap. And right in the middle of this information gap stood the Rosebud defeat experienced 8 days ago, and the truths revealed by that defeat. Untransmitted, unshared, buried. The list of things Crook knew almost exactly matched the list of things Custer did not know. Crook knew that the opposing force was at least 10 times larger than estimated. Crook knew that this force possessed the discipline and coordination to move under centralized command. Crook knew that the geography of the valleys provided this force with a crushingly tactical advantage. Crook knew that his own force of 1,300 men was forced to abandon the battlefield against this army. And Crook knew that Custer was advancing towards the same region, towards the same enemy, with the approximately 600-strong 7th Cavalry. Any one of these pieces of information, on its own, would have radically changed Custer's plan. The transmission of all of them together would perhaps have made Little Bighorn never happen at all. While analyzing this dimension of Crook's silence, a nuanced debate continues among historians. One group argues that Crook deliberately and intentionally withheld information. This view turns the silence into active treason. The other group suggests that Crook ignored his obligation to transmit information, that his negligence reflects a psychological mechanism different from, but as dangerous as intentional concealment. This view defines Crook not as malicious, but as cowardly. The difference between these two interpretations is meaningful legally and morally, but it is meaningless in terms of practical consequences. When 600 soldiers marched unknowingly to their deaths, the question of whether the source of the ignorance that put them on that path was intentional concealment or negligence born of cowardice makes no difference to the dead. The thing that makes a difference is this: the information existed. The person who possessed the information did not share it. And this decision not to share led to the deaths of hundreds of people through a direct and trackable chain of causality. The nights Crook spent in that tent did not enter the historical records. With what thoughts he slept, what calculations he spun in his mind, what balance he struck between his career and his conscience. These were not documented. But what is documented is this. In the reports he penned after Rosebud, Crook described the battle as tactically successful. He wrote that the enemy retreated, and his own forces maintained dominance on the battlefield. These statements were so far from the truth that it later emerged that even the command echelon reading the reports couldn't fully understand what had happened. And so, Crook's pen did what his bullets could not. It recorded Rosebud in history as a victory, at least until Little Bighorn shook the world. History generally wants to explain great disasters with a single moment, a single decision, a single person's mistake. This tendency is understandable. The human mind seeks clear and concrete culprits, not complex chains of causality. Little Bighorn has perhaps been the most striking victim of this tendency. For decades, the massacre in that valley was blamed on George Armstrong Custer's hubris, recklessness, and insane boldness. Custer went down in history as both the hero and the fool of American culture. The golden-haired, blue-jacketed, romantic idiot, joyfully rushing to his death. This narrative was convenient, because it is easy to pin the blame on a dead man. The dead cannot defend themselves. But historical detective work owes its allegiance not to convenient narratives, but to documented facts. And the documented facts show that the true architect of Little Bighorn was not Custer, but Crook. Or more accurately, that critical information void at Rosebud. Custer made a mistake. That is hard to debate. But Custer's mistakes were mistakes built upon a lack of information. Crashing into a mountain that does not appear on the map in your hand is the result of the map being wrong, not of failing to read the map. And the man who deliberately left that map incomplete was the man who had retreated south from the Rosebud Valley 8 days earlier. To understand George Armstrong Custer, one must first cast aside the legend surrounding him. Custer was, in reality, neither a complete genius nor a complete fool. His performance in the Civil War makes it possible to define him as a truly brilliant cavalry commander. He had distinct talents in using speed, pressure, and psychological superiority. But these talents came at a price. Custer was a linear-thinking commander. When speed worked, he was excellent. But in situations involving uncertainty and complex variables, this linearity turned into blind spots. Little Bighorn was, above all, an environment dominated by uncertainty and incomplete information. And Custer entered this environment not by a conscious choice, but as the victim of systematic deception. The orders and intelligence summaries he received from Terry's headquarters dramatically underestimated the number of native forces in the region. The sources of this underestimation were layered: inadequate reconnaissance, biased analysis, and the information gap created by Crook concealing his Rosebud experience. When these three layers stacked upon one another, the picture in Custer's hands became so far removed from reality that it was structurally impossible for any commander to make right decisions with this picture. Custer's psychological state on the morning of June 25th can be partially reconstructed from the testimonies of the surviving officers. Custer was optimistic that morning. This optimism stemmed not from a mad courage, but from the logical conclusion of the information he possessed. If you were truly facing a scattered group of a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people, it was theoretically possible for the 7th Cavalry to scatter this group with speed and pressure tactics. Custer made this calculation, and according to the data he had, the calculation was not wrong. The problem was with the data itself. The first reports from the scouting patrols that morning stated they had spotted a large camp. These reports could have stopped Custer. Some historians interpret his failure to stop as recklessness. There is a measure of truth in this interpretation. But at the same time, this must also be taken into account. In Custer's mental model, the term large camp evoked a certain number, and this number was within the small scale framed by the intelligence reports. Had he known the truth at Rosebud, the term large camp would have painted a very different picture in his mind. He didn't know. He couldn't have known, because the information he needed to know had been buried in a tent 8 days prior. Custer's decision to divide his force into 3 columns is the most debated point of the Little Bighorn narrative. Reno's column would attack from the southwest. Benteen's column would hold the south. Custer himself would execute a flanking maneuver from the northeast. This plan is not the kind of plan a commander who knew the true size and organization of the opposing force would make. Dividing 600 men into 3 means driving each piece against an organized force of thousands. But in Custer's mental model, this division made sense, because the enemy in his mental model was not large enough to overcome all 3 of these columns. He was wrong. And the price of this delusion was paid within a few hours. When Reno's column entered the valley, it faced the first truth. The camp before them was far beyond the estimated scale. The number of tents was expressed not in hundreds but in thousands, and battle-ready men were seen pouring from every point of the camp. Reno's force, within a few minutes, was facing a denser, faster, and deadlier version of what Crook had experienced at Rosebud. The retreat was disorganized and bloody. Reno's detachment sought refuge in the creek bed, casualties were heavy, and the force's fighting capacity was severely eroded in the first 15 minutes. These developments did not reach Custer, or they reached him incomplete and delayed. On the northern flank, Custer was continuing his own flanking maneuver. The last messenger carried this message to Benteen. Big village. Be quick, bring packs. This message is the document of the moment a commander realizes his plan has collapsed and asks for help. But by the time that message was carried, Custer's force was already stuck at the northern end of the valley, in a position where the return was blocked. What happened next is told not by official records, but by archaeology and the indirect testimonies of survivors. Custer and the approximately 210 soldiers with him made their last stand at Last Stand Hill. Archaeological excavations have shown how quickly this defense collapsed. The distribution of bullet casings bears the marks not of an orderly defensive line, but of a crowd that scattered in a short time and reverted to individual survival reflexes. The battle lasted between half an hour and an hour, according to estimates. In the end, there was not a single American left alive on that hill. At this point, the historical detective's duty is to go beyond chronology. The why question must be asked. Why did such a rapid and absolute collapse occur? The answer is multidimensional, but at its center lies the information architecture. Had the facts learned at Rosebud been carried to Little Bighorn, a few fundamental options would have appeared before Custer. First, to halt the operation and wait for reinforcements. Second, to adopt a more cautious and informed approach by strengthening coordination with Terry. Third, at the very least, not to divide his force and to establish a unified line. Any of these options would have changed the outcome of that day. How much it would have changed is debatable, but that it would have changed is indisputable. Crook's silence took all these options away from Custer. In American military history, disasters caused by concealing information or failing to transmit it do not begin and end with Rosebud. But Rosebud maintains its status as one of the most documented, trackable, and deadliest examples in this category. Because the chain of causality can be seen with unusual clarity in this case. Crook knew. Crook did not transmit. Custer did not know. Custer died. And along with Custer, the 210 soldiers under his command died as well. Every link in this chain is documented. What did Crook feel when he received the news of Little Bighorn? There is no answer to this question. At least, there is no documented answer. When Crook's diaries and letters from that period are examined, one does not encounter a single line directly referring to Little Bighorn, containing personal responsibility or regret. This silence is perhaps the most meaningful document, because an innocent man would have at least questioned his own role after such a disaster. Crook did not question, or if he did, he hid this questioning just like the information at Rosebud. His career continued. He received promotions. He retired. History recorded him as one of the important commanders of the Indian Wars. This record is technically true, but it does not include this. He was also the man who, to cover up his own failure, sent his colleague and his colleague's 600 soldiers in ignorance to a death they could have prepared for. Little Bighorn lives on in the American collective memory as a tragic tale of heroism. This narrative contains a certain respect for the soldiers who died on that hill, but at the same time, it serves the function of a smokescreen that renders the true responsibility invisible. Custer was reckless. This is true. But recklessness produces disaster when combined with a lack of information, not on its own. Had Custer's recklessness acted alone before that day, it perhaps would have resulted in a manageable defeat. But when combined with the information void created by Crook, this recklessness turned into the mass death of 600 people. What began on the morning of June 17, 1876, in that narrow gorge of the Rosebud Valley, was completed on June 25 at Little Bighorn. The 8 days between the two events constitute one of the most costly weeks in American military history, and the bill for this week was written not by the soldiers who paid it, but by the commander who created it. Crook's pen, while writing those reports, framed Rosebud as a victory, but history, in the long run, writes its own report, and in this report, the 8-day silence between Rosebud and Little Bighorn is written in bloody and indelible ink at the intersection of a commander's hubris and cowardice. Valleys do not stay silent. The earth does not forget. And history, ultimately, collapses upon those who bury the truth.
That is all for today. We will continue to illuminate the dark corners of history together. Stay with the American Timeline.